So much for the honour of this as well. I'm a nutritionist who's really interested in what we eat and how we move and how we sleep and how that improves health and well-being in our tamariki. And the simple fact is we live in a very different world, food-wise, than our previous generations did. So the vast majority of the food we eat these days bears little resemblance to the original form in which that food came. So most of our foods are these red foods with very few of these green foods. And even our supermarkets are designed to teach us to overeat, because when you shop, you actually only need to go around the outside of the supermarket to get all the food you need. In the middle has all the food that you want. So it is very easy to overeat, and it's very easy to under-exercise, and there are lots of things that can detract from our sleep. So this idea of the obesogenic environment really led to my first intervention about 20 years ago, where we introduced activity coordinators into several small areas outside of Dunedin, where traditionally they'd struggled to get a lot of sports going because of their size, they had a lot more transport issues and those sorts of things. These coordinators really became the face of physical activity and health within these communities, and by the end of their 2-year reign, they had parents falling over themselves to be involved in the school in a variety of different capacities. So they did a whole range of things, including organising things like a community top-down event. So Apple was one of the first studies in the world to show that these community-based interventions can successfully reduce the prevalence of obesity in children. And importantly, those differences were still apparent 2 years later, even when the activity coordinators were no longer present in those schools for at least 2 years, because they had been able to drive real community change. One of our different projects about play essentially brought Bulrush back into the school playground, and really based on this concept of the sort of cotton wool parenting, that children need to experience risk because they need to learn about consequence. And ideally you experience risk and consequence in increasing doses, because if you don't and are too sheltered, your first experience of risk might be behind the wheel of a car. That can clearly lead to some severe consequences. So a variety of schools in New Zealand were involved. They did all sorts of things. They let children climb trees. That's actually a bit of trick photography. It wasn't quite as high as that, but it's quite impressive looking. And things, really basic things. If they cut a tree down in the schoolyard and cut it into bits, leave it there. Leave those loose parts there, because one day there'll be a spaceship, the next day there'll be a fort, and the next day there'll be an obstacle course. Don't worry if it's really messy. We were interested, of course, in physical activity and found that we didn't increase physical activity because the kids were just doing different things, but the schools were really interested to see that we reduced bullying during this intervention. And what they attributed it to was to increased resilience in the children through this more rough and tumble environment that it created. Perhaps not surprisingly, our findings received huge media attention, both nationally and internationally, particularly the latter, who were so intrigued about the lawless nature of New Zealand schools. How we're feeding our youngest in the population has also really changed in recent times. I'm sure most of you probably introduced your young babies to solid foods using purees. You spoon-fed them, and then gradually you introduced a bit more texture and so on until they were eating pretty much what the rest of the family ate. There's been a bit of a revolution in infant feeding in recent times on 2 areas, baby-led weaning and these food pouches. In baby-led weaning, you totally bypass purees and spoon feeding, and you go straight to your infant feeding themselves solid handheld foods right from the start of the complementary feeding period. This is supposed to be good for appetite regulation and therefore better growth, but also around eating behaviours like food and fussiness and so on. More recently, it's these food pouches that are causing a huge amount of concern amongst paediatric groups. All food pouches have done is really replaced what we used to get in the cans and jars. It's essentially the same food, but it's got a different vehicle. So what the baby can do is feed themselves. So that's produced all sorts of consternation around their dental health. They might eat too fast, they're not going to be eating with the family, does it increase choking? A whole raft of concerns, and a lot of position statements have been produced by paediatric organisations worldwide, really condemning these pouches which form the market share of the commercial infant foods. However, there is almost no evidence worldwide about baby-led weaning or baby food pouches. And so these sort of world first studies have really contributed to that base. In Bliss, we managed to convince 200 families to be randomised to either bring up their baby using a baby-led weaning approach or traditional spoon feeding. And we found that by the time they were 12 months of age, there were no benefits to growth, so it didn't support those data, but they certainly were more adventurous around food, the infants who had grown up that way. More recently, we've been really looking into this pouch question, so a large observational study in a very diverse sample, and very careful measurements of dental health, which I trust you is difficult in babies, weight, eating behaviour, and a variety of other things. The bottom line was frequent pouch use was not terribly common, and in families who were using these pouches a lot, they were using them appropriately, so the infant was not feeding themselves. So these real concerns put out by these organisations don't appear to be matched by the evidence at this point. More recently, much of my research has focused on sleep, which is not usually the behaviour that comes first to mind when we're thinking about effective weight management. But we do know that not getting enough sleep is a very strong risk factor for children, and we know that our children are not getting enough sleep. So this led us to our POI study a number of years ago, where Dunedin families are very compliant. We managed to recruit another 800 women in the latter stages of their pregnancy. Half of them got a fairly typical food and activity intervention, and the other half received advice and guidance about promoting healthy sleep habits from birth. Children who had received the sleep intervention had just half the risk of obesity as children who had not received the sleep intervention, even still at 5 years of age. Most weight management literature, if you do show an effect at the end of your intervention, it totally disappears when it stops. These kids, we were still seeing benefits 5 years later. So why is that? After all, sleep is the ultimate sedentary activity. So why is it good for our body weight? And simply, we don't really know. We need experimental studies to actually prove this. So we recruited some kids, we made them sleep deprived, and then we sort of measured what chaos entailed after that. So one of the answers is that, of course, you're going to be less active if you are tired, and that makes sense. I bet if you're tired after a long day, a beautiful day like today, you might, think about sleep. But when you analyse these data properly, and children do sleep less, so they slept about an hour less over this DREAM study, that time has to go somewhere. Time doesn't magically appear or disappear, so something else has to increase. They were more sedentary, but they were also more, not less active. So lower activity does not explain the relationship between sleep and a body weight. What it's due to is eating. So they ate more energy when they were tired, and that difference in energy could easily explain the difference, the relationship that we see between sleep and body weight in children. Importantly, they were not asking mum and dad for more fruit and vegetables and eating more of these core foods. That extra energy was entirely from the treat foods, the red foods, the processed foods, and the foods would like to be a smaller portion of the diet. One of the big areas of child health that people are interested in at the moment is really screen time and the pros and cons of screen time. But one of the major problems with the moment is we actually measure screen time very poorly. This is how kids use their screens. It's rapid, they switch non-stop, and they're often using multiple devices. Do we think a questionnaire could ever assess this properly? If we're not assessing it properly, we're not doing the research properly. And so we've had kids wear these police body cameras, which give you that exact image in the home environment. We've got really good measures of screen time, what they're doing, when they're doing, and so on, and a whole range of outcome measures, which we hope will really help us understand the relationship between screen time and health and well-being. And just lastly, one of the new projects we're hoping to get going is we want to find some high schools in New Zealand that we can convince to have a later school start time. So why would we want to do that? Because biology changes dramatically in late adolescence. Your teenager is not being lazy in the morning when they won't get out of bed. Their biology has changed. They need to go to bed later and they need to get up later. But school and life gets in the way of that. I don't think many of us in the room here could consistently get up at 4 a.m. 5 days a week, and yet that's the biological equivalent of what we're asking our teenagers to do. A simple, equitable approach could be to delay school start times. It does increase sleep, and it could have a whole variety of health, academic and other benefits, including reduced traffic accidents. So our challenge, and big challenge in public health, is how to ensure that our research gets into policy and guidelines, but in a way that's equitable, fair and actually achievable, which is very challenging in the world in which we live today. I would just like to thank my many wonderful colleagues and funders that have contributed to this work, but also great-great-great-great-granddad Frederick John Knox, who was one of the founders of the Royal Society in New Zealand, which I have since learned over the last month. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Thanks a lot. I'm going to tell my 14-year-old son about the 4 a.m, 7 a.m. thing, and he's going to be delighted tonight. But when you say it's the biological equivalent, what do you mean? How do you work that out?
To be honest, I don't know exactly how they've worked it out, but essentially there's a real shift in our circadian rhythms in later adolescence. He probably quite hasn't hit it yet, so perhaps wait a year before you tell them that little piece of information. But yeah, we don't really know why the biology changes, but in later adolescence it absolutely shifts to be later to bed and later to wake, except that, yeah, we stuff it at that other end.
Other questions?
If you move the teaching day from, say, 11 o'clock to 6 p.m, what impact it will have on the teachers?
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a very genuine concern. So, I mean, we're currently doing a whole range of focus groups and interviews and questionnaires with teachers, kids, parents, transport operators, employers, every sort of conceivable stakeholder to look at the feasibility of this. And overwhelmingly, perhaps it won't surprise you, teenagers absolutely want to start later, and actually quite a lot of parents and teachers do too, but they don't want to finish later. But there are some simple ways around that. You can shorten each class, maybe about 5 minutes. I mean, we know educationalists convince me if I'm wrong, but it's only about the first 35 or 40 minutes of a class that's sort of useful. So there's some spare time there in the day. We can shorten lunch times. We can put free periods as the first study period, as the first period. There's quite a lot of mechanisms where we could potentially shorten the day without actually lengthening it at the other end.
Okay, please join me in thanking Professor Taylor for a fantastic talk.